Yes. So the format we've kind of decided on is to basically ask each of you a question that's been curated for you, and then we'll move on to the next person. So it's more of a I'll ask say one of you a question first, and then I'll ask the other, and then the third, and then it's like a one by one kind of format. And then once we've gone through the questions that we've made for you, we're we've decided to open it to questions that people might submit through, say, Twitter or YouTube or in the comment section, so to speak. Yeah, I feel like that's definitely okay, but maybe like so that it doesn't like interrupt another person, you could say maybe raise your hand a little bit, and once they're done talking, you could chime in and stuff. Because I want it to be also not too restrictive and allow you to, yeah, basically get your voice heard. Yeah, honestly, so right now I'm just getting uh the live stream started, and hold on, I'm gonna ask Lukman and Tiana, did you guys accidentally send a Google Meets link online or? Alright, someone I didn't recognize tried to join. Their name was Joshua. I see. Okay. I see. Okay, so I'm gonna share the link to Twitter right now. I'll share it to Facebook. I think Sarah will share it to Twitter. Yes, the YouTube link. Uh-huh. Just send it to me on Telegram in the private group chat. Right, so if everyone is ready, I can officially like switch from the starting soon tab to the group call. And I could start with, would anyone like to start first? Yeah, like, okay, so I'll get you guys to introduce yourselves, and yeah, anyone could go first, or I could just pick one of you, and then we will go in an order of me asking one of you questions one by one. Sure. Okay. That could work. That could work.
Your time has come.
Okay, so yes, I have started the stream. We're live. So yeah, I could get you guys to introduce yourselves, and we could start with Ron.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Ron Jeyathurai, and I am currently teaching, lecturing perhaps, post-colonial and diasporic literature, contemporary fiction, which involves postmodernism, and also a paper called Authorship, which is the principles and the philosophy behind writing. Um, I do this on a sort of a full-time basis. Besides that, I do write little musings. I'm not really active on social media. I do not have a Twitter account, but I'm always here to listen. I get a lot of DMs. Specifically, I do personal research on the queer community, and I advocate for them privately. Yeah, so that's about me.
Thank you very much. I will defer to Roshinee, and yes, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Roshinee Mookaiah, to be specific. I am a full-time NGO worker. I am a communications and fundraising manager at Yayasan Chowket. That's my professional work. But my passion project on the side is actually to curate. I'm the founder and curator of Malaysian Indian Anthology, which is actually a social media platform where I exclusively collect and publish stories about the diverse lived experiences of Malaysian Indians. Our objective is very simply about rewriting the narrative around this, underrepresented minority community. That's me.
Thank you very much. Vizla?
Hi, everyone. My name is Vizla, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I saw the banner on the ad that referred to me as an activist. I don't know. I'm not comfortable with this title. I don't know what an activist means. I am, however, I always say I'm in the business of change. As a psychologist, this is what I work with. And I take a very feminist approach in in therapy. So for me, personal change is inextricably linked to political change and social change. And what else? Yeah, I'm in my second year of my PhD. I hope to be done by next year. This has taken over my life, and I cannot have it here anymore.
Thank you so much. So I guess we'll be moving to questions. So I could start with Ron.
Okay.
Hold on one second, I apologize.
No worries.
There seems to be an issue with my mic, so I'm so sorry. Give me a
That's
second.
okay.
No worries.
Okay, apologies. So, Ron, you appear to touch a lot on colonialism, if I'm not wrong, and how racial divisions today can be traced back to the era of colonialism. So, could you try to elaborate on this and explain to us what role did colonialism play in shaping our understanding of race today, and how have those colonial effects been like reproduced to this day?
Wow, okay, that's a big question. Yeah, I think the most fundamental aspect to understand race is the idea that we have been stratified. And I would go back to this ideology called social Darwinism. I think that's really one of the biggest and the most important aspects of post-colonial studies. And we have seen how these divisions and these markers of identity, which we call race today, is still used, and it's in fact inaccurate, because race is a social construct, and I will stand by that. I would prefer to use the term ethnicity. But in the construct of the colonial sense, race was used with capitalism. So it goes together for economic purposes. And we all know here it goes back to one person or one entity, the empire. So we have had many empires. Yeah, we have been colonized by a few other people. But the biggest take, I would say, are the British Empire and the idea of race. And I think they did the same thing in India, which I would usually relate to in my studies, South Asian studies, and places like Southeast Asia, like Malaysia and Singapore, where multiculturalism in the colonial sense was based on the exploitation of labor. It's not a modern form of migration. A lot of this is forced. I think the same thread you can see happening or has happened in the Caribbean with the Latino community and African enslavement and the local indigenous people in the Caribbean. And we also have East Indians. Yeah, this is another horrible concept, East Indian, West Indian. Yeah. But yeah, in Malaysia, I think race, as we all know, is still prevalent today because we still attach certain stereotypes, economic functions, behaviors to a specific race. And it is never going to go away until we decolonize. So all these are big keywords. So one example is like I specifically look at literature, and I see this being applied in also in the historical sense, how Indian bodies are still seen as menial labor. And we have to come to the fact that only the top percentage of the Indian community are high income earners. A big portion of them are still in the lower bracket. And this is also colonialism happening again in the second sense that we do not may have gotten independence from the British Empire, but we are still colonized by other powers. And I would here call it as ethno-Malay supremacy or Chinese economic manipulation, or whatever you want to call that. And I think the most disadvantaged people here would be the indigenous people and the Indian community. So you see race applying everywhere, including the dating and the sexual aspect of a person, where we get usually turned down, or you would see advertisements saying no Indian. And the same thing applies in housing and rentals. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I think all this is attached to some structures which we find difficult in dismantling. Sorry, have I answered the question?
I believe you have. It's been very elaborated regarding, you know, how I guess you could say racial divisions in Malaysia are not clear-cut. They're very nuanced, and it's not very.
And it's also very intersectional. It's very gendered as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add on to what Ron might have said, and perhaps?
Yes, please.
With their own takes on this, basically how racial divisions have been influenced heavily by colonialism and how they've been perpetuated to this day.
I like to add something, just building on what Ron mentioned. This is something I've learned about recently, and I'm finding it quite interesting when I'm applying to my work. It's something called the scarcity mindset. Scarcity mindset, yeah? Yeah, so it's this belief that there isn't enough, okay? And I think we saw this happening with the responses to the Rohingya boat people, right? Malaysian responses to the Rohingya boat people. And we also saw this in particular from the ethnic minorities in Malaysia, the Indian community, Chinese community, saying things like, oh, wait, we aren't treated well, you know, why, you know, the little bit that we have, we don't want to share it with other people and those kinds of things, right? Of course, it's all xenophobic. But if you look at it, it's coming from this perspective that there's very little, and we've got to compete for what is already very, very scarce. And I believe that even the way we've thought about race in this country for, how many years has it been? 57 or 64? I can't remember now. We've got the race-based parties, right? Yeah, MIC, MCA, UMNO, and even that builds on this notion that this is all we have and this is what we have to safeguard.
Mm-hmm.
We can't allow other people to share. Sharing is not possible, and so then generation after generation, this becomes, it's perpetuated, right? And then we've got, the usual tactics of scare that then perpetuate these things as well. But from an intergenerational perspective, this is also passed down generation after generation. It comes up every time, after SPM results, after STPM results, and the spaces for university, competing for scholarships, jobs, like Ron said, housing, right? So this mindset perpetuates in every aspect of our lives, and then also creeps into our personal sense of who we are, our place in the world, and what kind of lives we can have and what kinds of futures are available to us.
Precisely, Vizla. I think I wanted to add on that one of my personal experiences with coming to terms with my own ethnicity was when in kindergarten, I felt that my dark skin was of a dirty color. And I looked at everyone, and it felt like lighter skin was something I would wanted to gain, right? And it's obviously going back to white supremacy. But I always say that this white supremacy can be reproduced by default in other nation states. And in Malaysia, we can clearly see who the aggressor is. Another point is that in education, I remember that race is not, you cannot escape from race, because you lose a lot of Malay friends as you go through schools, because they start to leave and go to boarding schools and things like that. And I think that you kind of lose out in communicating with the community. I come from a national school, mission actually, so I cannot speak on the vernacular school perspective, but it is also racist. Vernacular schools are not racist in that sense. Even in national schools, you do have divisions which exist. Even the way you sit in the canteen, the way you sit in class, who you mingle with, it happens. Including things like internalized, I think probably Vizla can talk about this, like how a lot of Indian kids, I remember I did this myself, and a teacher told us in class, why do you all say that Indians cannot do math? Only Chinese can. Please don't say that. Indians can do math. And this is something that stuck with me, because all my primary school years, I really thought Indians cannot do math, because I sucked in maths. I still do. But it is internalized, and everyone thought that Indians are good in English. And we carry this forward in our secondary school years. And I think I'm living to the stereotype, because I am teaching literature in English, so I don't think I'm probably the right person. But probably like to speak to an astrophysicist or an Indian astrophysicist or something. But in education, race still plays a huge role. We internalize this, and I see this with the Indian community. How we hate ourselves at times. We compare ourselves to very unrealistic expectations. And class. Yeah, if you're a very rich Indian, you come from very urban areas, you can afford private tuitions, you can put in deposits. I read Roshinee's post about scholarships. If you can afford to put in a deposit, you are considered very lucky. And of course, if you can get private education for full, your parents can do that, you're extremely lucky. But what about those who get full A's and they cannot access these spaces because they cannot put down deposits or whatever? What happens if they go in for interviews because they cannot afford things like good clothes, cologne? And that also comes from white saviorism, right? Because some race wants to step in and say, hey, I'll buy you stuff like that. So there's so many layers again. Okay, I'm going to shut up now. Somebody else can speak.
I think it's really fine. Like it was a good point bringing up, how despite being more of a Western concept, white supremacy can be manifested here. I guess an alternative label could be, anti-blackness in Malaysia. So thank you for that. Would Roshinee like to chime in, or would you like me to ask you your question?
Okay, please feel free to ask me my question. I think it can relate. Actually.
Sure, I do believe it can. So, Roshinee, to clarify to the viewers here, we've got quite a few viewers already. You run Malaysian Indian Anthology, which is a page on Instagram, I believe, which collects a variety of anecdotes from Malaysian Indian individuals about the discrimination they face daily, among like other things. Could you give some examples about instances of discrimination that are overlooked by most people due to like not being in our mainstream perception of what racism looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So Malaysian Indian anthology, it tries to capture all diverse lived experiences of the Malaysian Indian community. So it's not just challenges, but also all the good, happy aspects as well. When I was reflecting on this question, I came across two interesting themes about how my male writers and also the female writers who submit their stories to me, there's a different theme when they're writing. So what I've noticed is that our female writers, they tend to write usually about what Ron had mentioned just now. It's about how colorism impacts them. So it's a lot about, their perceptions of their self-beauty, their self-esteem, and especially for younger Indian girls, they talk a lot about how they feel very hindered because of their gender, for example. I know this was definitely the same for me. I felt like I had lost a lot. I had lost a lot of like pivotal, important, growing up experiences because I was very sheltered and I had to be kept indoors. So girls tend to talk a lot about this kind of discrimination, and it's not something that's from outside. Right? Sometimes it's by your own family members as well. Men, on the other hand, or even young boys, they tend to talk a lot about feeling they're discriminated. Yeah, my words are all over the place. My apologies. Discrimination for men is experienced in a very different way. Men talk a lot about being outcasted, be it in school, be it in a university work, or even in society in general. And I noticed when I was talking to my partner about this as well, some of this micro context of discrimination, right? We differ even between my partner and I. So I talk a lot about, representation of beauty, but my boyfriend, who is, very like obviously Indian male, he talks a lot about how he needs to be very extra performative in being a very gentle person or being a very eloquent, kind, nice person, because he's very aware of how threatening he might appear to other people by virtue of existing. Now, this is a different kind of discrimination, isn't it? And I never have to think about it. I think it's also because I have a bit of a lighter skin. I can pass off almost as a Malay, so I don't face this. But my partner does. And that's a different kind of discrimination that actually goes a little bit hidden. Yeah. So yeah, those are the two things that I thought about right now. Obviously, there are some other kind of discrimination. And I want to bring this to internalized racism, which was brought up just now as well. So we talked a lot about, oh my God, my words are all over. I'm so sorry. So on the topic of internalized racism, I want to bring this back to a little bit about classism, about how there's also inherent racism between different classes of Malaysian Indians as well. So this is something that I myself had to unlearn. So I came from a very underprivileged background. My parents were estate workers, very clear estate background. Education really wasn't like the priority, but my parents did. And I was able to go to a very like good school in my community because my parents prioritized that. And even then, even within my own family or in my own community, we talk a lot about how, even though we ourselves are estate community members, but we're different. By virtue of me going to school or me going to university, I used to think that, oh, maybe I'm a bit of a better Indian person, or I used to distance myself from other Indian people because I thought I'm not like them. And by conversation to a lot of my friends now, apparently this was also a common sentiment, like a hidden sentiment. And obviously it's something that I had to deeply unlearn and realize that is not the case. There's no difference between us. It's just a class difference. It's just that I was given extra opportunities at school that had enabled me to be who I am. And I'm sure that if the same opportunities were presented to my peers in this community, the same could be of them as well. So there's a lot of this inherent racism even among our own communities as well. Yeah, I think I'll just pause there for a bit.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Glenn. I just want to build on what Roshinee has said about that kind of internalized racism, right? There's a lot of pressure to be the model minority.
Yeah.
Correct? And I mean, I felt this, it was interesting when Roshinee was talking about education. I felt it, as I was pursuing higher education. And my mother's friends were cautioning my mother, like, how can you let her do this? Who's going to marry her? That was an actual thing that was said to me, okay? And this is the thing, this idea that there is this well-tread path and you must stay on it, because if you deviate, then people are going to think badly of you. And one person's choice is going to be reflective of the entire community.
Yeah.
So we have to behave in a certain way. And I feel it as a woman. I hear this amongst my LGBT clients, my LGBT friends. Even I think, and it's everything lah, whether it's your choice to get a tattoo, or to get a fourth piercing, or any of those things, right? It always comes back to, wait, we can't be that Indian. You have to be the respectable Indian.
Yeah. And I think that's that's an important thing to note, because when we distance ourselves, that would also mean that the perfect person to champion such issues, we are distancing ourselves from being able to help that community members, because we feel like that's not my problem, or I'm not like them. And so it tends to become like we tend to be ignorant of our own community, who are very much in need of our assistance. Yeah.
Completely agree. I just wanted to chip in on what Roshinee said about in text, in text, right? Fictional text or otherwise. The differences in gender. I think this is really clear. Also because it's funded by patriarchy, that the men usually go out to get to go out to work. So therefore they would write about experiences in job discrimination and things
Yeah.
like that. Whereas women, that whole idea, stereotypical idea of beauty, consciousness of color. But I think yes, it goes yeah, clearly. And you can sort of relate this. I do not like to posture the Malaysian or the Malaysian Tamil dialogue with the Black community in the United States and in the UK, but it is important to use some of their concepts like Black consciousness on our bodies. I think it's important to see how the effects of othering happens, like how Black men are overly masculinized and overly sexualized. I think the same thing happens here with Malaysian Indian men, whether they are heterosexual or not. The whole idea that they have to be top, they have to be mask performing, therefore desirable, but you need to know how to thread the line, because you don't want to be too overpowering and therefore seen as a threat, because an Indian man is still seen as a threat. The way people lock their car doors immediately, and on elevators they move. Yeah, we can talk about this another forum or maybe at the end of this. But I think with women, like Tamil women, they have their own set. And another colonization is the Tamil men themselves. They impose that kind of patriarchal upbringing on the way they control their daughters, their wives, their partners. So I think there's another form. And Tamil women are the most oppressed, if you ask me. I'm speaking on a male privilege. Somebody else can probably chime in. But I feel that male supremacy among the Tamil community is also very high. Can we blame them? I don't know. But we posture ourselves to whiteness. Hence, this is why we are having this conversation in English. It'll be interesting to ask Tamil-speaking Malaysians who do not have access how and how do they cope with this kind of discrimination, like being turned away at a market. I know of people who, because they didn't have change, they were turned away from buying certain things. And how generally, this happened to me in an urban space, how people of other ethnic groups would move away from an Indian man when they sit in a public transport because of an alleged Indian smell. And this is something which is very interesting, because I do not know what an Indian smell is, but it puts people away. Deeply psychological, but yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing. I think your answer actually pertains to the question I'm about to ask Vizla. And it's that, so Vizla, men in patriarchal societies are made to, as Ron mentioned, conform to an archetype of masculinity in order to be deemed socially acceptable, like in regards to repressing their emotions, or being expected to be the breadwinner of the family, etc. So like these gender roles also tend to be like racialized as well. And considering like your work on the intersection of gender and like race and sexuality, like how are these expectations projected onto Indian men specifically, and what are the long-term effects of this, say, internalization?
Well, I think the most the most remarkable difference would be the internalized racism that Ron has already mentioned. It is and it manifests in different ways. It's about putting certain standards on yourself so you don't look like those Indians. You have to be different. or developing certain preferences when you're dating women. For example, I only date X race or Y race or whatever it is. I've heard this myself. Indian girls are the worst. I've heard it myself. Those kinds of things are manifestations of that kind of internalized racism. You need to distance yourself as far as possible from that identity to make yourself different. And you might say, well, it doesn't sound so bad. It is bad because it's really putting a lot of pressure on yourself, right? You have to perform at a certain level. I mean, even ordinarily expectations of traditional masculinity on men, it's very isolating. Men find that they can't form connections. They can't form long-term connections. They're very lonely. Right now, there's an epidemic of loneliness, and it's higher amongst men. So it is already a very isolating experience. So add to that this element, this layer, and it becomes even more isolating. And I suppose this is where the stereotype of the drunk Indian man comes from, or developing drug problems, anything like that. Substance abuse problems is not a moral issue; it's a pain issue, right? And it's emotional pain, it's physical pain that needs to be expressed, that needs to be manifested, that needs to be acknowledged. And when that isn't given space, I think people will seek other ways of doing that. Other ways is like what I suppose Roshinee has described her partner, right? Some people are just more sensitive to other people's reactions, right? And so you will adapt your behaviors to suit that. That's okay, of course, and we all do that in different social settings. But when you recognize that the problem is not how softly you're speaking or how loudly you're speaking, but the problem is you, it can cultivate deep self-hate.
Yeah.
And when you don't like yourself, how do you like other people? When you don't love yourself, how do you love others? So this is also where things like anger issues, depression, anxiety, and a whole host of other kinds of mental health issues can arise.
Thank you very much, Vizla, for giving your input. Would anyone like to add on to what she said? I mean, if not, don't feel pressured to, please. I believe that we've talked about this quite a fair bit. I want to switch the topic a little bit by asking Ron another question. So, kind of back to colonialism. So, one specific element of colonialism, or like post-colonialism as it is today, that you tend to focus on, it seems, is the literature and the role like that plays in modern-day racism, Ron. So how pervasive are these racial tropes in colonial literature today, and what do they look like with regards to Malaysian Indians, and what should be and what could we do to change this?
Wow. Okay. I think I'll just begin on this note of a concept called deconstruction. It's a way of reading fictional texts, and I feel that fiction. This is what I teach. Fiction. There is a big percentage that we write from our subconscious. The subconscious reveals itself in works of fiction because we are allowed to have imagination. If we can, I cannot put a percentage on how much that imagination is unreal, but imagination comes from a place of truth as well. So this is why I decided to not be a historian, but to look at literature because it reveals the psyche of the oppressed. Colonialism, sorry, my words are all over. Colonial literature per se is something I have avoided because it's always told from the white eye perspective. And they always describe themselves as the savior and the people they colonized as savages, and the slaves or laborers, coolie. This is another interesting word, yeah, very specific to the Caribbean and Malaysia. So when they write things about their journeys in coming to Malaysia, or being a resident, or controlling a certain economy, it's good to read to know how they thought of us. But I think it's also important to look at writings which come from people who have been oppressed and colonized, because then they reveal a lot about their personal experiences. I remember recently a lot of people were they were demanding that we come up with facts and figures to talk about racism and colorism. And this is where I have to stop, because the moment you try to academize or scientifize, there's no such word, but I'm just saying it here, colonialism, racism, and all that, you are in fact trying to attach a kind of value on it, on personal experiences. So personal experiences can never be, made typified. So back to text. Yeah, I think post-colonial literature in Malaysia, we have a range of it. My personal favorite is K.S. Maniam. Also, although it's a male voice, right? But I think he was one of the earliest to clearly talk about othering, whiteness. And I was just thinking about this person. There's a character called Miss Nancy, who was Ravi, the character's first English teacher, and how she taught them how to brush their teeth, and how to clean themselves. And this question of hygiene still exists today, because people still think Indians can be dirty or are dirty. This is why they don't want to rent houses, they don't want to have sex with you, they don't want to date you. So it goes on. So what happens in fiction can exist in reality. Yeah, so I think there's this line which we must blur. We shouldn't be separating fact and fiction. Another point, in colonial data, or what we read in history, is still one person's perspective, or the perspective of the victor or the colonizer. So it's interesting, because deconstruction, for me, I was first introduced to this by this person called Ranajit Guha, the Subaltern Studies group. And it's this whole idea of double reading and reading text from another perspective. Another person is Jeyathurai Spivak. But today we have come to realize a little problematic, because it's caste. Which brings me to the next point, because colonialism reproduced the caste system in Malaysia. We don't see it, but the caste system is just nefarious. It exists especially between heterosexual communes, where there is a question of progeny. Because arranged marriages, I think everybody has seen the Netflix series. I only could do it till the second episode, and I couldn't continue, because it triggers me. Because caste, people still like to use the word, I'm saying it once, people like to say the word paria very openly. Now that is the N-word equivalent for the Tamil Indian community in Malaysia. I don't think anybody should be using it freely. Even if it's in fiction, I think there needs to be a lot of tact. But words like that have existed in literature. I have seen it, and I think maybe Roshinee can say, I don't know whether anybody has submitted works with those kind of slurs being involved. But it has its implications on us. And sorry, Glenn, I think I missed out. What is your last part of the question again?
No, don't worry about it. I think even if it's not super relevant, I think it's helpful. Sorry, but yeah.
No, you said something about what can I do with it.
I was talking about like what could be done to change this, like this the racism that's still prevalent to this day.
Yeah, I really cannot point to a specific answer. I think what everyone here is doing, especially Vizla with mental health, and Roshinee with advocating for people to just write, don't be afraid to express your thoughts. And with me, when I teach, I think we need to specifically encourage Indians in this country to talk about their pain. Don't hide them. I believe this is a concept which, again, I'm going to bring up. It's called racial injury, racial trauma. And it has been used to analyze a lot of literary texts. Anne Cheng talks about it in the Asian American perspective. But we can also look at it from the Malaysian Indian, or just the South Asian diaspora. Yeah, it's very important, diasporic studies, to look at how our bodies have not just been colonized, but our minds as well. And a lot of these things are carried, what do I call it, genetically or intergenerationally transferred. Insecurity, I think, is very high. This could be me, I may be projecting here, but we become very insecure when we see other people doing well, people of other ethnicities doing well in life. When I say doing well, you can interpret it as however you want, economic or whatever. But these things remain with us. Sorry.
No. Thank you for sharing.
Can I add on to what
Yes.
Ron had said? I think
Yes,
it's very
yes.
interesting that Ron provided a perspective from like literature and text. So Mainan, maybe to Mainan, I just want to add like a perspective from how Malaysian Indian people are represented in media in general. So the reason why I even created Malaysian Indian Anthology is because I want to create more positive and nuanced representation. Because I myself, before I came into NGO, I was in the theater sector, very glamorous, but actually isn't, because there's not much opportunities for Indian community members to be in the spotlight.
Mm.
Even if you look back at ads in general, right, with the exception of like, the typical Deepavali ads, let's take a moment to reflect what kind of roles are given to Malaysian Indian people. And what I've noticed when I was analyzing this was that we are typically put into a typecasted in subservient roles. So, for example, you are the guy serving another person. You are the Milo Ane guy, you are the mama guy, you are the mechanic. So you are still portrayed, even in mass media, in a subservient role or in low-paying jobs, kind of, that kind of roles. Even myself, when I get recommended to a casting director, they're like, "Oh, you recommended." They said that you're good, your skills is very good. Can you send me a headshot? The moment I do it, I'm like, "Sorry, the client isn't looking for someone like you." And I'm like, "Well, my skills apparently were good enough to get me there, but my face was not." So this is a very interesting trope to analyze. I don't know if anyone remembers, there was even like that DG ad some long time ago, a few years ago, where they did like brown face, and it's still on the internet. You can take a look at it. And then they do all the cliches with their head shaking and their hands and everything. So it's very, very problematic because that is how we are portrayed, and that's the kind of stereotype that is still perpetuated to the larger Malaysian mass media, which is a bit upsetting. Yeah, just sort of putting that out there as well.
Hold on. Before we go into the next question, I think Glenn was echoing in someone else's mic or speakers. So is it fine that if you guys aren't speaking at the moment, could you keep your mics muted? And once it's your turn to speak, just unmute them.
Yeah, I'm
Thanks,
afraid
guys.
it might echo a bit too much. Thanks, Lokman.
Yeah, you're not echoing anymore, but
Okay.
there was some feedback.
It
But
was a
yeah,
bit, yeah,
fine.
but no worries. So
All right.
I think Roshinee brought up a really, really good point in that how even today, say, because literature can be seen by some people as a bit of a exclusive thing, right? Not everyone has access to like most literature. I don't believe it's widely spread, right? But like mass media, like television, radio, and all that, like as someone who is part Singaporean as well, like I think not just a DG ad, there have been multiple instances where you have blatantly racist caricatures on media. Like last year, there was a huge scandal with brownface, and just last week, a couple weeks ago, someone saw a book in the National Library in Singapore, which was a Chinese book, which was like depicted incredibly racist stereotypes of Indian people, and it was in Singapore's National Library. So yeah, just wanted to share. I'll be moving on to Roshinee's next question. So, okay, so we obviously understand racism between us as a large political system of disenfranchisement. And however, the idea of a collection of anecdotes might not corroborate something as broadly systemic. So, could you explain to us why anecdotes are still very important when trying to navigate racial issues? Would you say they're necessary, or more like a necessary supplement to more structural analyses of race?
Oh yes, for sure. I think this goes back to like what Ron had mentioned earlier. When we're talking about all these big issues, it's kind of dangerous to only quantify it to certain facts and figures, because that really removes, the nuances of the lived experiences of individuals, the actual emotions that they experience, their mental health, their family relationships, and all that. So this is where stories are important. That's why I do Malaysian Anthology. Because let's just say if you're talking about, let's just say, trying to improve the impression of Malaysian Indian people, we want people to have better positive regard towards us. By just presenting these facts and figures about how Indian people are discriminated, it's not something that a general public can empathize with naturally. It's very hard to make care about us just through these numbers. And this is where stories always have to supplement it to show the deeper nuances. And why are stories important? Is because they give you insight into someone's life, into their mind about how they live their lives. So, for example, Ron had talked about people using certain words. So, in my collection of stories that I have published, again, these are real life stories shared by our writers. No one used the P word, but there are stories where our writers talk about the consequences of feeling very dejected or very demotivated when someone called them the K word, especially this coming from teachers, their teachers. So one such story was by an Indian boy, a student in Klang, and someone said it out loud. The discipline teacher said that you all Indian boys, you're gangsters. This is how UK community behave, is expected. So obviously it was very demotivating. And he really created a very immersive story within 200 words, and that was very viral story on its end because it resonated with so many Malaysian Indian people, and it was strong enough and immersive enough that non-Indians could also take a moment to just read it and understand the pain that comes with when you are using that kind of word. So this is why stories are so important to create that shared immersive experience. I mean, obviously it's not the same as a real thing, but it's the closest thing you got to feel like you can relate to another human being, to make them care about you and feel like they can fight for you as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Roshinee. Would anyone like to add on to that? Because Ron, would you like to?
All over the place with my thoughts. I agree completely. It's also this fact that when Indian Malaysians share their stories, it's a trend, or perhaps something is observable, that it's the Indian community which empathize the most. They were the ones giving love reacting or sad reacting to the posts, and they are saying like, "Oh my God, same," and things like that. But then you have a pocket full, but it's a very good majority of non-Malaysian Indians. I won't say who, but they typify and say this could be related because you did this or did that. And I want to bring up the colorist issue and also tainting to racism, which happened in Parliament a few weeks ago when Kasturi Pato was called dark. There were people defending and saying the light was bad. What? And I'm like, the light may be bad, but that's not a ticket for you to pass remarks, which is also misogynistic because it comes from a dark-skinned Indian male. And you see this happening. So stories, I realize, even in the Malaysian Indian context, a lot of people typify it. I don't think Malaysians are a mature group of people. I think we have decades to go before we can have discourse. But I'm glad social media is still a space where we can express, but I think we must also accept that there's going to be conflicting voices which will come, and not all of us are mentally prepared. Cyberbullying, doxing is still very common. I've seen a lot of Indians who share their stories and then eventually get a lot of private messages from people from other ethnic groups shaming them. And I also wanted to agree to one point about, because Roshinee does very voluntary-based submissions. But I think that I'm very sure it is, the literary realm itself, mainstream publishing is still very elitist and classist. Usually you see they're all very well-educated, English-speaking Indians who submit stories, and also they come from a place of very, very essentialist place. Sometimes they speak on behalf of lower caste people, sometimes they speak of people from lower classes. This is something to talk about. I think it happens even in the theater industry, as Roshinee's talked about. Especially when the person who writes these things are not Indian. When you portray a lot of these stereotypes and assume healing, transformative healing, how your character develops, I think it all makes a difference when you do have an actual dark brown person who comes from that cultural background doing these things instead of doing it by proxy, and then have other brown people as tokens, to sort of hold you up and say, hey, you're fine, nothing's wrong with you. I think if this happened in Black America and somebody white tries to do this, they'll be completely cancelled. But in Malaysia, they still seem to like, fine.
I just want to add to what Roshinee and Ron have already said. Roshinee was talking about representation, and then Ron brought up the issue of class. I was already thinking about this. The only place we see Indian people represented is in cinema from India, right? And of course, cinema from India is deeply divided. You know, you've got the South Indian cinema world, you've got the North Indian cinema world, and within the South Indian cinema realm, you've got the Telugu films, the Malayalam films, the Tamil films, and then, you know, it's very, you know, it's very vast. But I think the most consumed in Malaysia is Bollywood, and Bollywood is horrible because it is classist. They only want to depict, there's this very ethno-nationalistic tone in Bollywood cinema. They need to pander to this colonial idea of the Indian. They need to pander to this idea of the model minority who's moved to America, who's moved to the UK and has made it big, who lives in castles or whatever it is, who's dining with the president or whatever it is. And of course, in India, there's also that colorism, right? So you'll only see lighter skinned actors and, you know, actors in these roles. You know, I remember watching Shah Rukh Khan, and he started off a different color and he's a different color now. You see these, you know, people like Aishwarya Rai or Priyanka Chopra, when they appear in Tamil film or in Indian films or in Indian ads, they are 5 shades lighter than what they actually are. So, you know, there is a lot of these kinds of things, but people associate this, right? Malaysians associate this. Fair Indian is good Indian because they're the ones who are rich, they speak English, they drive big cars and all those kinds of things. And then there's also this divide, right? So you've got the kind of very box office kind of films, and then you've got the actual artsy films, and the artsy films are gritty and they are raw and they are real, and you've got no makeup on, and there's, you know, whatever, like, I don't know the term for the lighting and all that use. So you see the darker skinned Indians, and it's usually, you know, they use lower classes, or in India it's still a thing, caste coming up in cinema and stuff like that. And then people make that connection, oh, that means dark skin means poor, without taking those deeper kinds of readings and interpretations into film and cinema, right? And so you also then create and perpetuate a classist idea of what the Indian experience is like, what Indians are, what kinds of Indians are appropriate, what kinds of Indians you can fall in love with and sleep with, and what kinds of Indians you have to stay away from, and all those kinds of things come up. So I think you cannot remove the class perspective within also the international arena and tying it back to the local arena. And now we have to take into consideration the rising Hindu fundamentalism in India and how it's influencing the way Indian is being discussed, the narrative of the Indian, and how then that juxtaposes with the experiences here in Malaysia, where the roles are reversed, but the antagonist is the same. You know, and you know, ideas of ethno-nationalism, what is a citizen and what isn't, and all those kinds of things. It will be playing out. And picking up what Ron said, I'm struggling to find a way to have a discussion about this in a healthy way, because it's so difficult to do, but so important to have. Okay, I think I've spoken enough.
No, I don't think you have. I would actually ask you a question actually that pertains a little bit, it adds on to a little bit, because in your work you talk about the intersections between gender and sexuality and how two marginalized identities affect each other in creating very distinct forms of oppression. And pertaining to a little bit on the conversations we've had regarding the model minority myth and also masculinity, like hypermasculinity, so to speak, how are issues of transphobia, homophobia, and sexism influenced by a Malaysian Indian racial identity?
Again, I think we have to take the class perspective, because with higher social class, there is a certain element of protection, you know. You may be able to benefit from family connections when it comes to work, job security, or applying for loans or any of those, especially if you're a trans person and you have to change your name and those kinds of things, right? So, and if this is something that many LGBT people talk about, probably moving to a country where there is a friendlier atmosphere to LGBT people. And migration is also classist. And the options that are available to people from higher classes are very different to the options available to people from the lower classes. So then it's these few things that become the saving grace: education. And education is such a deeply political issue in Malaysia, with and it's so limiting and limited. And then you find people who don't have those resources getting into huge debt and all those kinds of things. And then this is how also, I remember very starkly, I can't remember who it was. Poverty is not about a lack of education. Poverty is about a lack of money, right? And so we educate people, and then they go into debt or whatever it is. And then it's very hard. It doesn't break the cycle of poverty because you have to keep paying back the loans. And then you have to, this idea that we'll educate the oldest child, we invest everything in them, and then they're going to save the others. That also, aside from putting all this stress and pressure on the one person, also then gets them stuck in a very different cycle, a very difficult cycle as well. And then you combine that with the internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, and you will have a lot of very difficult issues to reckon with if you were, LGBT or T. The pressure amongst the Indian community to get married, to live the heterosexual script, to abide to it, no matter what the cost. And there are huge social sanctions if you don't abide by it. When you are already feeling, as a minority, you're attacked on so many levels, right? Is that one more thing you want to make yourself vulnerable to? Is this one more sacrifice you have to make? And Ron talked about racial injury just now, right? And it is a form of trauma. It's a form of emotional trauma. And these things are passed down from generation to generation. And it's passed down through emotions. There is this myth of the dramatic Indian mother or Indian woman or whatever it is. There is a reason for that, because emotions then become the only way for you to express not just the sadness, but the injustice of what you're experiencing. And that's also perpetuated generation after generation. And so, of course, it becomes difficult for the gay Indian man to decide to pursue, or to live his truth, because he's expected to get married and produce grandchildren. And then otherwise, and I get this question all the time: what if my father or mother gets a heart attack and dies? And I have to explain that that's not how heart attacks work, but that fear is there. And this is what's guiding their lives. They live every day with those kinds of fears, with those kinds of worries. And it takes up space. It takes up emotional space. It takes up physical space. It has a toll on the body. And it takes up brain space, because now science shows us that this kind of thing actually affects your ability to concentrate, to pay attention, to do well. So it does have long-term impact.
Thank you, Vizla. If I could try and summarize what you were talking about, would you say that it is incredibly difficult to be more open in, say, like society like Malaysia, in which things like homosexuality and all that are ostracized, especially if you are less fortunate, because you're talking about from a classist point of view, right? You're talking about how if you're already in a bad financial situation, coming out or just outing yourself would be an additional burden on an already highly stressful situation, right?
Yeah. I mean, being LGBT in Malaysia is difficult for everybody, but we see how it's even harder for people on the margins. I worked with an Orang Asli trans woman, and I saw, the kinds of issues that she dealt with were very different. The kinds of issues that people from other ethnic identities come with. And because of the very capitalistic nature of our society, class then offers you opportunities, right? The lower your social class, the lower your social status, the fewer opportunities are available to you. And then, you just have to compete with others. And sometimes you just have to people feel that they're forced to make very difficult decisions that compromise themselves in order to be able to break free from these things and to build a better life. That's also the Malaysian dream, right? To build a better life. And what success is. Success is a house, 2 cars, I don't know how many point children, those kinds of things. And that is so deeply entrenched that it's very difficult sometimes to imagine other possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying, Vizla. I think my next question will be for Ron. It's a good segue, talking about queer identities and more marginalized communities. So, Ron, in your book, The Double Colonization, you delved into how queer Indians specifically inherited some of the most brutal effects of colonialism. So these queer Indians have clearly been erased from mainstream narratives surrounding the era, even in more, say, liberal circles. So could you try to go over what queer Indians face, what struggles they encountered during colonialism, and how has this oppression lingered to this day?
Okay, I have to acknowledge my privilege. I identify as cis male, but I cannot speak on behalf of other spectrums on the LGBT. But based on what I did, my research was on cis male gay Indian men in general. But I specifically wanted, this was a hope. So if I do my PhD, I'll probably look at that. But descendants of indentured labor, I think that's the biggest portion of our so-called modern migration into Malaya at that point by the British. That's why I said even using the word Malaysian Indian makes me feel uncomfortable, because what is an Indian, right? It's very coded. It is a nationality as well. It's weird to say you're Indian when you're in the global north, because everyone assumes you will speak Hindi, because then you think you are, Modi is your president, whatever. But we are Malaysian by nationality. It's just a very passport documented word. But I think the ethnic identity, a lot of Indians still hold on to that. Your Tamil, your cooking, the language you speak in the kitchen and the household. And if you're Telugu, you're Malayali, you're Malayali. And I think over time with colonialism, you see these structures, starting to amalgamate. And it was done by force, right? They wanted to unite all these brown-skinned people as Indians, and all these multi-ethnic groups as Malay, and then all these other dialects as just Chinese. And we live with that structure today. So when I was analyzing it, I looked at that inter-ethnic desirability was also organized on the idea of white supremacy, where the lighter your skin, so if you are Chinese and you are a gay male, you're obviously seen as premium and close to white men. And then you got Malays, because you have that whole very indigene concept of exoticism, right? I know a lot of white men who travel to Thailand to, get into extracurricular activities with Thai men because they want that specific skin tone. And they do this in the Philippines. They come to Malaysia. Well, sex workers are very legitimate. This is not shaming, but I think there's an element of exoticism there. And if it works to the benefit of the sex worker, great. But what happens is that Tamil men or Indian men do not and cannot afford that privilege, because even within themselves, a sort of self-hatred. They want to become lighter skin. Many of them do not like the color they were born with. And then they do not want other Indian men because of some past trauma of exert of masculinity. And then you have another level, which is the rejection by other ethnic groups in Malaysia, whether it's the linguistic form or your bodily structure. Indian men too hairy, such a turnoff, very dark, very this, very that. But on certain instances, like I said, hypermasculinity, or they want this Indian man because they want to get pleasured in that way. So you can see that we are still used as this kind of a token, where you use it as you please. And I think it really affects, I don't know, Vizla has talked about it, she can probably go through that again, on the desirability, the effect of feeling ugly as a gay male can affect you. So much so that you in fact lose trust in compliments which people may genuinely want to give. So that's one. Number two, I think access to even sexual health. Because of the patriarchy, a lot of men, they do not want to get tested because of the stigma. Because the Indian man, this is very stereotypical. Yeah, I'm not perpetuating anything here. This is just for discussion. They want, the common stereotype that bottoms usually will carry a viral load, and the concept that an Indian man always tops, therefore he doesn't necessarily need to carry the virus. This stereotype is still propagated, and a lot of Indian men do not want to get tested, or they don't because of these reasons. Of course, there are many others, like accessibility is one of them, but it's this ingrained idea. And I also discussed about the way described in literature, in some of the texts. I remember there's one fantastic collection, the Malaysian Queer Anthology, edited by Jerome and Pang some years back. That book was great, but again, when I was analyzing it, I still couldn't find or perhaps many Indian characters to identify with. I still feel there was some form of an erasure which happened. Well, because it's a product of the time. Probably we should collect one in 2020, right? 2021. This could be a project for all of us. But it's interesting to see that a lot of these, even fictional texts, carry these stereotypes and prejudices. Yeah, this is in regards to the gay male community. Yeah.
Sorry, what Ron has said.
Yeah. Please.
So when you talked, Ron, about the Indian men and their belief about viral load and top and bottom and things like that. I mean, as a health professional, I automatically went to health education, right? And there's nothing essential about these things, right? It's not something that is essentially Indian or anything like that. Obviously, there is a gap in how information is being disseminated. Who has access to this information? And a whole bunch of other questions which are public health related. And this also is an indication of the marginalization of both the Indian community and then the Indian queer community as well. Because obviously the more marginalized you are, the less access you have to these things.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vizla.
No,
Thank you.
That's fine.
Thank you. Roshinee, do you have anything to add regarding this? It seems that I thought you were trying to say something, and I believe.
Oh no, sorry. I was just like nodding my head a lot because I am very much like cis and I'm in a heterosexual relationship. So this is actually my first time hearing about this and learning about this, honestly. So yeah, thank you for sharing about that.
I see. No worries, no worries. So if you don't mind me asking you another question, Roshinee. So it's a bit of a tangent, but it also relates to education. So we know that you actively are involved with an educational NGO. So could you care to elaborate to us what problems do Malaysian Indians face when trying to acquire education, and is there racial inequality, and if so, yes, what effects does it have in both the short and long term?
Okay, that's a very long question. I'll try to summarize it.
I'll ask you the first part first. So
yeah,
essentially, what problems do Malaysian Indians face when trying to acquire education?
Oh my gosh, I feel like there's so many different parts to this. I mean, if you think about like the colonial aspect and like the poverty aspect, I feel like Malaysian Indians are already at a disadvantage in accessing certain kind of educational spheres, just in general. If you're talking about academic performance, consistently the data shows us that Malaysian Indian students, they tend to, we have the higher dropout rate compared to the national average. We have a lower passing rate compared to the national average, and there's even a distinct difference between like Indian males and Indian females as well at a school level. You notice that because of this lack of education access or quality education access, because technically everyone can go to school, but not necessarily everyone follows through until SPM, right? Because you notice that people are dropping out others at UPSR, PM, or even SPM. So when you have this kind of like limited education experience, that also then leads to a lack of access to higher paying jobs. And then the cycle kind of continues. Now let's assume that you already finished your SPM. Great, you're very, very lucky. Okay, you already go through the major hurdles already. Then you are faced with another kind of discrimination, right? Which is like even to access university. I can speak from my personal experience about how difficult it was for me to attend university. It's very easy, and I noticed that this is something that I'm now experiencing again with one of my mentee, who I'm trying to get her to university as well. It's very easy for people to say, just go for public UA. That's the most affordable option. But even accessing public university is so difficult when there are quota systems in place. And sometimes even, and when you think about the other option, going into private university, then financial issues is another thing that you have to think about, because not everyone has that. As is the case with my current mentee, even when she has secured a full scholarship to attend a private university in the course that she wanted, she's still unable to afford all the other hidden fees. For example, transportation, food, technological fees. Because of MCO, you need to use internet. You don't have internet, then sorry lah, you're goner. So there are so many of these hidden things that are keeping you from even getting education, which everyone says, if you work hard, then okay lah, good. Myth of meritocracy, right? If you work hard, you'll be successful. If you don't succeed, it's because of your own fault. But even when you have all these people trying so hard, there's still all these other factors, systemic barriers against them from achieving it. So yes, that's one thing that I can think about at the moment. I think that's the first question. Yeah.
That was the first question. So I was just trying to ask you again, is there racial inequality? And if so, right, what effects does it have in both the short and long term? Because I think one of the facets you mentioned that in the short term, you have a lot of people dropping out before they finish their SPM and going to higher education. And then a long-term effect of that would be, the generational compounding of that, where, people who don't have higher education have their children probably not being given the same opportunities. So what are the other, short and long-term effects of this?
In terms of the question of like whether there is racial inequality, for sure. And I think it is, again, moderated by poverty and all the other aspects that I had mentioned earlier. The long-term effects is, as you say, the cycle kind of continues, right? Your parents are poor, you still can't afford to go to school. Even if you're smart and you're capable, you go to school, maybe you're asked to drop out because you need to help your family survive. Even if you're smart and you go to school, like the whole system, you still can't afford university, you still have to drop out or take a lower paying job. An interesting thing that I've come to notice recently, and this is shared by my partner who works in university preparation and also in the scholarship industry, is that especially for Indian students who come from B40 communities, they actually have a bit of a limited option because of expectations on them, i.e. they feel like they are pigeonholed into specific sectors, right? Obviously the main three, was that lawyer, engineer, and especially so medicine. Medicine is so highly revered in the Malaysian Indian community, and especially if you are a poor student. And I know that my dad was very into this as well. They feel like that's the greatest thing that can change your life. Get the highest paying job possible. But imagine if you're a student, number one, you already lack certain resources all this time, and then you're expected to achieve this. It can be very demotivating and it's very hard. So even when they're trying to apply for certain universities or courses, they're already automatically pigeonholing themselves to very small courses only, especially for medicine, which is already so competitive. And if you don't have the resources for it, then your chances are even so limited. And then you notice that the students are becoming more demotivated. And then at the end, they either can't take up the course or they just take up a course that they're just naturally disinterested in. And when you don't have a specific interest in that course, then you might not be able to perform and therefore can't really excel. Therefore, you can't get a good pay out of it, right? Because if you're not excelling, you probably won't get as promoted. So there's all these short-term and long-term effects that's happening, but at a very like micro level because of this as well. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Roshinee, for elaborating. Because it's very valuable to hear from someone so involved in education to know the challenges that people face. Does anyone like to perhaps comment or add on to any of the things Roshinee said?
I just have one observation that I realized that as I was growing up, I think one of the things which I was told, not just by my mom, but other people who were in my favors, they were like, Ron, the first thing as an Indian is that you must get the highest education as possible. Of course, no mention. Yeah, of course, the doctor, lawyer, pilot, engineer, accounting thing came But when they realized that my hands were going this way and I was reading more books than anything, then they were like, okay, this guy is definitely artsy, wordsy. But I need to do a PhD because the title doctor is like a big thing. But I realized the psychology behind that is because the motivation to do well is so deeply entrenched with race, because there's always this idea that Chinese will inherit their parents' money and they will open businesses, they'll become entrepreneurs, and they'll be very well. And then, of course, you have the other stereotype that Malays will be taken care by the government, right? They will have everything handed to them on a silver platter, and therefore it leaves you to struggle. You have to dig the dirt. So you want to do that kind of job, or you want to be in higher income. But so it's this fear again, some twisted form of motivation, which I think generally, I have to ask my friends, push them to be in professional services today. I don't know how many of them are doctors, lawyers, engineers by choice or by pure passion.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that percentage is influenced by their parents, but interesting to know that motivation also goes both ways, because I've spoken to those who come from the estates, and a lot of those Indian aunties told me, why should I let my children finish school? For what? What is the purpose when they are not going to go anywhere? We are already poor, and so what if they get a better job? They don't see that there are some benefits. This is capitalism again, chasing that white ladder, going up, trying to be corporatized. But if it elevates poverty, I don't know. So this is where, again, I don't know, maybe this is your concluding point for this talk, but we need really radical policy changes which really sees to the needs of people like this. Because if we are not doing anything to encourage them to at least get that kind of education, then we are going to fail another generation, and it's going to be continuous. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Sorry, can I add my experience with education? Sorry, and this is perhaps a gender perspective as well. I come from my father's side of the family is very conservative, and in the beginning they were very opposed to my pursuing higher education. But for some reason, my grandma. Oh, you've got a little head through the door, Glenn. For some reason, my grandmother had some time to think about it, and then she supported my decision to pursue my further education. And for her, it was a means for me to protect myself. For her, it was inevitable that, number one, I was going to get married. Number two, I was going to be married in a relationship where there's unequal power relations. And therefore, number three, I will be susceptible to domestic violence. And therefore, education is not so that I can work while I'm married, but it is a little stick I can beat my potential husband with to say, you do not have the right to hit me. So that was my grandmother's rationale to support my pursuit of further education. And I think, there was no matter how much I tried to explain to her how domestic violence happens, how rape happens, power relations and gender and all those kinds of things. For her, it wasn't. It is an inevitable aspect of being a woman in society. And I think this is also and my grandmother, I come from a fairly privileged background as well. I'm very privileged. And I think this is the other thing about these very narrow perceptions of race and ethnicity that we are raised with in this country. It really limits your opportunities to think about or imagine, or even be brave to imagine. Not even just imagine, or even to allow yourself to imagine different possibilities, because in your head, this is inevitable. This is going to happen. What's the point of fighting it? That's number one. Number two, the point of dropping out that Roshinee raised and also Ron raised. You spoke to those families, they're like, oh, what's the point of going to school? I suppose when I was in school, I was raised to believe that if you don't pay attention in class, you're stupid. I read somewhere much later, and I wish I can remember where I read this, but not learning is a form of protest. It is not passive, it is an active form of protest. So if children don't want to learn in school, something is deeply wrong with the syllabus, something is deeply wrong with the education system. and kids don't want to learn. And I don't think this is just an Indian problem. I think this is a wider problem. And in terms of radical policy change, I think education, not just policy, but everything about education also needs to be radically changed in this country.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to add on to what Vizla said? All right, fine. I shall move on to the last of the questions that we've made for you guys. It'll be one for Vizla. And after this, we'll be moving on to audience questions, of which we have received quite a few, and we're trying to pick them and rephrase them in a more coherent manner. So, Vizla, so to remind the audience, you are a clinical psychologist, right? You've done a lot of work on mental health and the structures of oppression surrounding it. So, there are barriers to both attaining knowledge on mental illness as well as receiving treatment, be it financial, cultural, etc. So, what do these barriers look like for Malaysian Indians who suffer from mental illness, and like how does it render their struggles differently?
Okay, so there are the barriers of accessibility. All right. Right now, mental health help is available in community clinics and also in general hospitals, but it's in the larger hospitals. There's a long queue. There's a long line. There are the more physical elements of accessing mental health services. But I think bigger than that is the stigma. The stigma of, number one, having a mental health problem, and number two, getting help for that mental health problem. This is not particular to the Indian community. I think this is a problem that all communities face. But with the different intersections and the marginalization and the vulnerability, you see the effects more in these marginalized communities. There is still this. I joke about this. My competition is the BOMO, okay? My competition is the BOMO, all right? I don't know how many poor chickens have to die and those kinds of things when people have these kinds of problems. So yeah, I see more people talking about going to the local priest or going to the BOMO, or you have to go to this temple and go around this particular deity 9 times and offer this and offer that and you'll be better. There's a lot of these superstitions, and when we start talking about mental health, there is this, I can see it in their faces. There's a recognition that this is what it probably is, but this fear and reluctance to then take the next step to get help, to say I need help, or to ask where can I go, and then of course there is the shame also of having the label of, oh, you've got a mental health problem, right? So I think that would be one of the biggest barriers. Now, I'm not a proponent, and this might be controversial, I'm not a proponent of having more counselors and more psychologists. That's not going to end our mental health problem. I think radical policy change, starting from education, needs to be implemented in order to minimize the risk of mental health vulnerabilities throughout life. And also, I cannot see how good mental health and capitalism go hand in hand. But in the meantime, I suppose this is what we have, but looking more at community-based mental health approaches, community-based mental health services, where you bank on communities' resilience, you bank on community knowledge, individual knowledge. People have lived for generations. How have they lived? How can you harness that and develop good mental health? That's something I'm more supportive of. Definitely. In the last 20 years, Singapore has really done a lot to reduce stigma regarding getting help for mental health problems. Singapore used to have one of the highest suicide rates in the region, and they decided to sit down and take it seriously. Singapore and Malaysia, we have the same law, so they decriminalized suicide, and they now made mental health far more accessible. It's available in public hospitals. There are mental health teams in every department. It's not just in the psychiatric unit. It's built into every department. A mental health practitioner is called for any patient who shows up at the hospital in distress. At one point, they were taking clinical psychologists from Malaysia to fill in the gaps in Singapore. And so I think they've done a lot. And obviously it started with the government. The government, changing funding, prioritizing this, changing the laws, and a whole bunch of other things that was initiated by the government. And like you said, you see those ads in public transport, on the highways, and that also makes a difference because it just normalizes getting help for mental health distress. No worries.
Hold on, Glenn. It seems that you are muted on the stream, so I'll just ask the question now. Right, so our first question that we have received privately, it relates to MISI Solidarity's larger campaign with the IPs. I'm also muted for some reason. Okay, that's weird.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. I fixed it, so I should be
Okay.
showing up in the stream.
Yeah, okay.
So, would you want me to ask the question, Lukman?
Sure. Just check if they can hear you,
Okay.
because I've been receiving messages that
I
you were
see.
muted and I'm
Okay.
also muted.
You could check in the stream. I should be fine. I think it was just a little issue with the mic in the streaming software. But yeah, is there any? Can they hear me, Lukman?
Yeah, they can.
Okay, perfect.
Seems
Okay,
like it. Yeah,
apologies for
okay.
the technical difficulties. I would like to remind the audience this is our first ever stream, and please bear with us. We will try to get this right moving forward. So the first audience question has been asked, I believe, by the first audience question has been asked by Brian Chia. So he asks, as non-Indians, which I believe I can also ask this question coming from myself, how do we become better allies to the Indian community in a way that goes beyond performative activism, in a way that goes beyond posting stuff on Instagram with hashtags? How do we go beyond that, and how do we help better your material circumstances? Would anyone have an answer to that? Like, how do people who are Indian help?
Maybe I can try.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sure Ron and Vizla will be more eloquent in this, but it's also a concept that I have been kind of learning and educating myself on, especially with the BLM movement in America. And I think it is the difference between performative activism, i.e. like saying that you're not racist, and being anti-racist. And I think that's such a interesting and powerful concept to learn from. They talk about, the danger of being moderate, right? So instead of saying like, I think we are all aware about these injustices and this discrimination that is happening to the minority community, but what are we actively doing to be against it? So for example, when you are in a family setting and someone says that is deeply troubling or racist toward a minority community, would you be the person saying, actually, I'm not racist, but I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, or I'm just going to let that slide because I don't want to create conflict, and therefore you're still allowing that stereotype or that harmful thought to continue? Or are you going to be someone who is anti-racist and actually take the time, even though can create some conflict, but take the time and the effort to actually challenge that negative perception? And that's the difference, right? Of being not racist, which is actually, I guess, it's more like, it's like you tenang hati lah, thinking that you're non-racist, and the difference between that and being anti-racist, aka actually standing up and taking a stance against these harmful stereotypes. Yeah, so obviously some of the ways that you can do that is, for example, speaking out, putting your money where your mouth is, i.e., donating to specific causes or fundraisers or even NGOs that are working with this specific marginalized communities. Yes. I'll stop there first. Maybe Ron and Vizla might comment further.
Sure. Would Ron like to chime in?
Yeah, I'm going for all those keywords which you're always these buzzwords you see on your Insta feeds. I think Roshinee is right. I think another one I wanted to add on is that we need, you guys in that sense, need to stop being allies but accomplices, because allyship is still something very neutralized. When you say you're an ally, you are usually doing it because you feel the need to do so without, but when you're an accomplice, you feel the anger on our behalf. You tend to sympathize with us more, and you are able to speak up for us when we are not there. So if you're in an all Malay, all Chinese setting, and somebody says something problematic, you are basically sort of our voice. You put people in place, you call them out. I think this is very important. It is performative, yes, but sometimes that performatism is very important because we need to know who's visibly there for us and who is not. That's just one point. And the second one is the whole thing about listening. When we tell you stories of how we feel uncomfortable, what we experience, don't push it away. Don't rationalize it. Don't try to come up with some statistics and data. When we say Indians are poor, a lot of poor Indians, just listen first. If your immediate reaction is to rebut, it tells you a lot about how much work you've put in towards being an anti-racist. Yes, it's true. We need to come to a point where we identify as anti-racist and not just say, oh, I'm against racism. There is a difference in that. And I think these little things help make you, it helps yourself, obviously. It's also for clout sometimes, right? But it also helps the community because we are so small in number. We cannot exist in all these places. There are some people who have never met or mingled with Indians in their life, and they live in Malaysia, and that is very sad. I've even seen comments by little Chinese kids who talk comment very disparaging remarks on an Indian lady because the lady comes to clean their house. And then we'll talk about things like, why the lady so smelly? Why she this? Why she that? And the kid has never seen Indians. So I think exposure again. If you are, a breeder, you're a reproducer, please take your kids to force them. I don't know. It's what I'm saying now is going to go against a lot of things I believe in. But sometimes you need to actually make your kids mingle because racism is a learned behavior. I think, or I would say with that. You learn it, and if they never met anyone dark skinned in their life, and they're immediately going to start learning these things from their parents. I'll probably come back to something I meant to say and completely blanked out, but okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so just building on what Roshinee and Ron have said, but again, on the idea of being an anti-racist, it's not just about calling out racism done by other people. It's also being aware of your own racism. Now, I believe that we are all racist because some of these things are so deeply entrenched. And if you look at human beings, automatically it's a survival thing. We do automatically categorize people into other, right? Just because it's an automatic thing, though, just because it's a very human response, it doesn't mean it's okay. It's also a very human response to hit people, but that's not okay, right? So these things are not okay. And sometimes we don't even know that we have these ideas. We don't even know that we believe in these things. And so, like what Ron said, if somebody is telling you, listen. And if somebody calls you out, also listen. Like, don't be defensive. Of course, the natural response would be to defend yourself and say, oh, I didn't mean it that way, or whatever it is. But just listen, say you're sorry, and think about how you can do better next time. And also building on Ron's explanation about, some Malaysian kids have never interacted with Indians before. I see this a lot, and this is my pet peeve when people call me Miss Kumaresan. Okay? Now, a lot of Indians, our names are patronymic, right? It's not a family name, it's patronymic. That means it's our father's names. So on my birth certificate, it says Vizla anak perempuan Kumaresan. That means Kumaresan is my father, right? I do not understand how Malaysians don't know this, And so when they will call me Miss Kumaresan, and I'll have to explain that that's not my name, that's my father's name. How do you not know this? How are you a Malaysian and not know this? Like, you never met Indian people, ke? You've never read about this. You don't know. Okay, you don't have meet Indian people. Like, you've never even developed curiosity for people's names. I find that very, very. I mean, people have called me being petty for this. I don't think it's petty. It is. It shows me how much you are even thinking about me as a human being, when you are approaching me, and I'm telling you, don't call me Miss Kumaresan, but you insist because you think that's the right way to call me. That's not on either.
Thank you for bringing that to light. Yeah, I believe it's just something that a lot of Malaysians are just not aware of. They don't realize that it literally means daughter of, or like anak lelaki. Yeah. So, I think I speak. This is coming from me. I think I might speak for a few non-Indian people, where sometimes we might have encountered this before, where we speak out on your behalf regarding things that maybe someone has said that's racist or something, and we're greeted with. I hope some of the viewers can relate to this. You speak out for people who are, say, using the K slur, or just being very discriminatory, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, and then you're greeted with the reply when you call them out. But you're not even Indian. Why are you speaking in their behalf? Why are you being so sensitive, or trying to speak for other people? Like, would you have a response to that? Because I think people have gotten that before. I've gotten that before. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe I can speak on this. I'm a cisgender heterosexual woman, and I'm an LGBT ally. And I call out people on the daily for these kinds of things. I don't have to be LGBT or Rohingya or any of those things to call something wrong, wrong. If it's wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't matter which category you belong to. You have a right to speak up about it.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. I think I think we've talked quite a bit about this question. What we could do is move on to an upcoming question, and it's the one that we were about to talk about before we experienced a bit of technical difficulties. So it's regarding the police, right? So as I was talking about, Malaysian Indians do make up a disproportionate amount of custodial deaths and are overly represented as victims of police brutality. Would any one of you want to talk about why this happens? Any possible reasons?
I just quick one. I cannot profess to say that I am an expert of the law. And I also want to safeguard all of us here, because a lot of these topics and issues are, not well received by a lot of people on the upper layers, and also some forms of the lower levels. But I think a lot of these are stereotypes, I feel, which have been also internalized a lot. Like seeing the Indian male as very as a demonized caste type, right? And we see the kind of prejudice. This happens in the United States, where it has been documented how black men are more disproportionately shot at or arrested by the police for doing the darnest thing, like probably just taking their dogs out for a walk, or just getting their kids something, and they get arrested. And you have seen videos on this because the movement is so trending over there, right? And we see these forms of violence being filmed and passed around. But in the Malaysian perspective, I don't know if there's research on this, and I'm very curious to know. But I feel that a lot of people in power look at dark-skinned bodies as people who will probably commit crime. And I think if we live on that assumption, it's quite clear why and how a lot of Indians get picked up, even from a random car, a traffic roadblock. It's always Indians who are always asked, "Did you drink? Why are you going out so late at night?" Questions like that. Like, as a male, I've had it. And Tamil women also, they tell me things like, "Oh, the police will be asking, why are you going out unescorted?" And like, this is 2020. Why does a Tamil woman need an escort to come home from a party? But these are things perpetuated by people in power. So it makes us think that even gender, there's a difference, but it's very race. I know drunk driving and death is a very sensitive issue. A lot of people talked about it, but I don't think it's racially accurate to say that all Chinese and Indians drink and therefore causing everybody to die on the road because of the rates. There are, of course, some science behind that. But I think if you're going to hold someone up and only isolate Indian men as drunkards and therefore have special inspections on them, that's very problematic. Now, what happens after the arrest? What happens when you're going to make a statement? Whether you come out alive is a risk and a known fact that all of us have lived with. This would resonate a lot with what the Black narratives say. And I think it's true. I mean, I come from a family or a class system which we don't really have to deal with that because we don't have that kind of tendency. But I know of neighbors who have told their sons that, if you can run, you run. Or if you have to go to the police station, take 2 to 3 people with you. Why? Why have that fear? Is because they know that they may not come back, Yeah, I'll just leave it as that.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just go next to bring up 2 points. My first point is, I think, Ron, both of us have the same book. Are we referring to the same book, Ron? We both have the same book. Oh, sorry, my cat is in the way. The second point is to answer the question. Now, I'm obviously not trained in answering this question, but I think I would like to suggest, we need to re-examine, why is it that Malaysian Indian people are, for some reason, making up such a large percentage, even in the, prison system, for example. I think that's a good question to start from. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about, because of the lack of access to even quality education leads to a lot of this, B40, especially B40 Malaysian Indian community members having to take up low-paying jobs and having to resort to, when you are in this kind of communities, then some people, this is where they go into certain gangsterism communities or certain crime-driven groups, because that's where they feel like they have a communal bond. They are able, as a group, achieve a certain kind of lifestyle, right? And obviously, this is where condensed crime becomes rampant and so on. And then therefore, they are obviously, because they're in this culture, therefore they're more likely to get incarcerated for it as well. I'm just questioning out loud. Again, I'm not the person to know about this. I wonder if, people, police, or maybe I'll just say this, I wonder if the system thinks that they can get away with it because they think that, when we are keeping, for example, these Indian bodies inside the system, or even if, they are being brutalized like this, that they think that no one's gonna defend them, or they don't have the resource to defend themselves, in terms of bail, or even to fight for them if anything happens to them. I wonder if that's the case, because that's the impression given to them. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud, which is a rhetorical question in my head.
I have something to just quickly add to what Roshinee said, and something I said earlier. I remember going to the police station. I hate going there. The 2 most hated places, the police station, the hospital. I'm very afraid. I have a white coat syndrome thing. I'm very afraid. But when I went and a friend had to make a report, and I looked up on the board, and it was from a former IGP. Yeah, I don't know who, and this person clearly said, "I don't care if you are Indian, Malay, or Chinese. If you commit a crime," and then there's he had another quote. But I'm very sensitive with the linguistics of the way we portray our narratives, right?
Yeah.
For the first time in my life, right, I've seen Indians relegated to the first level. I don't care if you're Indian, Malay, and Chinese. Everywhere you go, it's always the M, C, and I. For the first time, the I has gone up to first place. That itself says a lot on how we assume and project a lot of these crimes, and how it sits in your psyche that Indians are going to be problematic. And yeah, it goes across like why you don't even rent houses to Indians because of alcoholism and curry, and therefore your wall gets stained. But those things really stick. And I think in the prison system, I don't know, are there statistics to tell you how many inmates we have who are Indians, and are they really there for the crimes they did, or is it because they lack representation? I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say
There's
that.
a bit of it's not exactly clear regarding guilt, right? But it is a fact that Caucasian Indians make up less than 10% of the population and almost half of all custodial deaths. So that's a very glaring statistic that we've brought to light regarding our research. So yeah, that it is quite incredibly ridiculous, honestly. So if we want to move on to the next question by the audience. So apologies to the audience, we can't answer every single question. There are quite a lot. So this is one regarding education. We've tried to compile a few of the educational related questions into one. So the audience has talked about how we covered quite a bit about the powers of education prior in the forum. But what about the detrimental effects of our, so to speak, Malay-washed syllabus regarding in pre-higher education? Would that add to the racial trauma that we carry?
I guess that's me. To clarify, I am not an educator, but I can share a bit of the anecdotes that my partner, he was a public school teacher, and he definitely agrees to to them being this kind of Malay washing of our curriculum. And I think it does have certain consequences when you as a minority community don't see yourself represented. Or even if you're represented in a very specific kind of way, in almost a caricature kind of way, or even in a detrimental kind of way. Because again, the way that we define ourselves and our identity is very much based on the stories that we hear. And the stories, it could be from your family members, from mass media, or in this case, the place when you are growing up, where you spend most of your time at, which is school, which is the books that you're reading. So it definitely has such a large consequence on your identity formation. Yeah, okay, I'll just stop there for a moment.
Just a quick one on Malay washed education. I think that's very accurate. And I don't know how this question came out, but it's really amazing that we can have this conversation today. I think a few weeks ago, maybe days, I'm not sure, there is this Instagram page called Club Bunga Raya Manchester. It's actually Manchester University Malaysian Student Association page. Yeah, I hope I said that right. And they actually came up with this amazing, Insta thing. On Malay washing in literature. So I think it goes back to the education as well. If you check it out, the person who wrote it, I think it's Malay himself or herself, and they've done a fantastic job. But it's true. I mean, I went to national school system primarily. I didn't really come to a consciousness that it was Malay washed. But when I went to secondary and I studied history, I think this is where people in power exert power. Right? You want to change, you want to control the narrative, you want to stay relevant in a very flawed political system. The one way to do it is you manipulate how you convey education. And I think that a lot of our textbooks, not really get in trouble for this, but a lot of our textbooks need to be edited. A lot of things need to be really looked at. And I think the history component especially has a lot of things which are really irrelevant and completely makes us feel that we still owe some form of this whole idea of the social contract, right? And there's this idea of ownership, sole ownership, not even shared. There's no shared value. Everything is, there's this idea that we owe these people a lot of gratitude. That's what I'm looking for. And it is this ideology that we have been shoved in, and it's seen in the text. And the whole emphasis on the Form 4 syllabus, I don't know what is it now, but I remember it then, it was completely unrelated to being Malaysian. I understand that a lot of things, especially religious beliefs, have a lot of hold in how a certain culture, a certain society has evolved and continue to exist. But when there's an overemphasis, it turns people off from reading history. I think a lot of Malaysians, when they finish their SPM, they say they hated history. They just memorized to get the A. I fell in love with history only when I went into sixth form because it really opened my eyes. We had really things like history of Southeast Asia, history of Asia, a little bit on World War I and II, and things like that. And of course, Islam was another component. And I also fell in love with history when I did post-colonial studies later on because I'm like, hey, how come there were things that I never knew? And as what Roshinee and me picked up just now, this little Bible here is a compilation. It has been worked on by previous Indian Malaysian researchers, which have really done their best in trying to give that Indian narrative. And it's missing from the national curriculum. Or even if it is there, it is written in such a way that it's always considered subtext. And this is something we have to reconcile with. I don't know if we all have, in this house, we have power to do so, but those who do and to those who watch this later, something to consider.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very comprehensive book. Yeah. Oh my God, that's so complicated. I feel like I genuinely don't know. I've had this conversation with my partner, right? When you see a majority culture use your culture for example, for your you're using mehendi, for example, you're doing a Bollywood theme for your wedding, and then yeah, using mehendi and you're using all this kind of culture. You're using our songs, you're using certain kinds of food, or even but without giving due credit to the culture that it originated from. Or you're doing a Bollywood type wedding, let's just say, and then most of your guests, none of them are even Indian to begin with, or you yourself are not of Indian ethnicity. It always rubs me a certain kind of way, but I'm kind of afraid to talk about this because they always say the same thing. Oh, but it's me showing appreciation for your culture. Like, what's so wrong with that? Like, I'm hyping up Indian mehendi culture. I'm hyping up Indian cooking. Da 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 da. But yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about Iran and Vizla? Because I think between my partner and I, we are so conflicted and confused.
I'll have to repeat the question because I think some people didn't catch it. So I was asking the panelists, do you think it's a form of appropriation of culture for us as Malaysians to continue celebrating, so to speak, or using Indian culture with, like Roshinee mentioned, mehendi and like other dances, costumes, and basically facets of Indian art? Is it appropriation if we keep using that while being ignorant of its history and exploitation? So
I don't know if it's appropriation. I mean, Ron may be, better able to talk about this because I feel it's very clear. It's very different talking about cultural appropriation in the American sense. And I'm not sure if that's something that is you can just cut and paste in the Malaysian sense, right? And I don't know enough to be able to pick out the nuances. But I think I'm all for that, put on the Bollywood dance, themed wedding, wear the mehendi, do whatever, but don't treat me like I'm not a human being. I mean, I think culture is a ubiquitous thing, and I don't think humans have to defend our culture. Culture will evolve. Culture has been around far longer than we as humans. It will evolve, and it's supposed to evolve. If culture doesn't evolve, something's wrong. But so it's okay. I don't mind. But don't call me Miss Kumaresan. Don't like don't be surprised that I can speak English. Or don't be surprised if, hey, I'm an Indian girl who has short hair and no, I don't wear the potu, and that's okay too. So don't pigeonhole me and don't tell me that's all I can be. For me, that's it. The more of the one-on-one everyday interactions, that's what really irks me.
So, Vizla, would you say that you find it okay, right, just to celebrate Indian culture, but just not to like degrade it into like to objectifying it, like Indian
Yes.
things as like something to
The
like.
Indian culture comes with Indian people.
Mhm.
So if you're going to appreciate Indian culture, please appreciate Indian people too. You don't have to put them on a pedestal or anything like that.
Just treat them
But
like normal human beings. Is that- yeah.
yes,
Thank you.
just that. I'm all for. My favorite outfit is the kabaya. So I feel like if I say people shouldn't wear the sari, I'm being hypocritical, right? I
Mhm.
love wearing the kabaya. I love wearing the cheongsam. So I think that should not change in Malaysian culture. But I think this added element of recognizing the human that comes with the culture and respecting the human that comes with the culture is necessary.
Thank you. Ron?
Yeah, I think I'm glad I'm speaking last because I see both their perspectives and I always join it together. It's difficult to use the white aggressor kind of a concept an appropriation in the global north to the global south because the global south is already very mixed and we have decades and generations of inter mixing, right? That the a lot of things are blurred, a lot of cultures are shared, and as what Vizla said, culture will change and will move on. But I think we have one of the things which we have ignored, I think, and I specifically acknowledge this, should have done this in the beginning, that the power relations. I think power relations are so important in how we even define racism, how we define colorism, and in this sense, what we call a kind of an appropriation. Because in all these instances, I feel like a lot of Indian dancing is done in a very comical caricature way. And you get this in schools. I mean, something innocent, but in Malay and Chinese kids will be like shaking their heads and talking to you. And they will try to imitate that. And then you grow up thinking it's okay. And then when people do it as adults and you realize, I don't speak like that. And I remember there were a lot of advertisements where it has been done. And then, you have these non-Indian casts reproducing these kind of things like shaking their head excessively, wearing the potu. A lot of people have even criticized Nandini Balakrishnan you know, for her, is it Tirunuru? Have I got it? Am I saying it right? Yeah, and some of them have even said it's considered brown face because she's doing it for marketing purposes. And I'm like, wow. But I think another question on power relation and the dynamic here is that a lot of this is Bollywood. It is not representative of the South Indian community. I cannot for once identify with any of the Khans and any of the Kapoors. And it is used as wedding themes. And yeah, people want to do it. And yeah, I think it's fine, no harm. But like Vizla said, you need to treat the same appreciation you supposedly have to celebrate your special day. Make sure that when you leave the ballroom, you are not ill-treating your Nepali guard who has looked after your car while you are celebrating indoor. You are not ill-treating your thing. But again, not on social, not just on capitalist value, but even your friends. You don't necessarily need to talk to your friend in that way. When you're trying to imitate. Yeah, it's very tricky area. I just think that we should celebrate each other's culture, of course, but there is a power dynamic there. We can celebrate Malay culture, we can cook, we can eat, we can dress however we want, but when it's going to be involving indigenous or really oppressed, marginalized communities, I think it has to be treated with some form of respect. Like I would definitely not want anyone to wear the headdress of any Orang Asli community in Malaysia for a Halloween party or something cool and say, hey, I am a Malaysian, therefore I can wear this headdress. Yeah, that is quite insulting, if you ask me. Yeah.
Thank you. I definitely think there's a lot of tact involved. Like, just I guess a general rule of thumb is to be a respectful person and practice what you preach. Don't glorify, like, say, Indian art by having an Indian wedding, then go out and insult and demean other, like, Indian folks. Like that's a great point, right? Just be consistent and be like a consistently decent person and treat people decently. And I think it's a good takeaway from this. It's a very succinct takeaway from this. So it is approaching 4 o'clock, so I think we shall come to an end of the live stream. So first of all, thank you all so much for taking the time to do this with us. It's our first live stream, and all of us at MISI Solidarity are more than thankful for the time that you've given to us today and the time in preparation before this. Thank you to the audience. We have had quite a lot of viewers. We even reached up to 40 concurrent viewers at one point, which I think is quite surprising for such a small organization like us. Before we close off, would any of you like to plug or your social medias or anywhere that we can, say, follow your work if you so wish? If it's you have a blog or your social media, and this is completely optional. Please don't feel pressured into giving it, but if you do wish to share, let's say, your Instagram or Twitter, you may let us know, and when we upload the video, we'll put it in the description so people can find your work if you so wish. Roshinee, would you like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So I have my personal account, which is Roshinee Mookaiah.
Mm-hmm.
Alternatively, I think I would very much like to plug a Malaysian Indian anthology.
Mm-hmm.
And we are, you can view us and follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, and also Facebook. And if you are Malaysian Indian, I would highly encourage that you submit a story, because I believe everyone has a story that we all can benefit from, that we can learn about. And if you are non-Indian, then give it a follow, read about all these different diverse experiences, and encourage your Indian friends to also submit a story.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So that's
Malaysian Indian Anthology.
Malaysian Indian Anthology. Thank you very much. Vizla, is there your account you would like to share? Is there any work you would like to share?
I'm on Twitter. I'm not an active tweeter. I do retweets quite a bit. And if I retweet something, I disagree with the retweets and not endorsements thing. If I retweet something, it is something I endorse.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to learn about LGBT stuff, if you want to learn about mental health, you can follow me. I do tend to retweet a lot of the more educational, service-oriented tweets.
I see. Okay. So would you want to include your @Twitter handle?
Oh, sorry, I'm very boring. So my Twitter is just my name. It's just @Vizla Kumaresan.
Sure. Okay. We will include it in the description. Ron, I know you mentioned you don't use Twitter much. Is there any platform you would like to share, or please don't feel pressured to?
Yeah. I actually not really. I am active in social media in a private sense. I don't use Twitter, but yeah, on Instagram I usually retweet. I mean, not retweet. See, I'm using that language. I repost or share a lot of stories from groups which I feel very affiliated to.
Mm-hmm.
It's very Tamil centric, and it's also very queer in forms of solidarity purposes. So if you want, I have my Insta, and it's RJEYBAC, RJBack, which is almost like my name.
I see.
Yeah, and we can have a conversation.
Sure. Thank you very much. A few closing remarks. Again, thank you so much. And it's also worth pointing out, Roshinee, that the chat has mentioned your cat a lot, and they think your cat is incredibly adorable. It's just sleeping there. I think it's adorable as well. It's just
His name is Ramesh.
Ramesh is so cute. And yeah, so thank you very much. We'll try and condense this session and include the transcripts and so on and so forth. So yeah, if anything, I should be done here. If Lukman and Tiana wish to have any closing remarks, I can ask them. But yeah, Lukman?
No, I'll just reiterate what Glenn said. Thank you guys so much for agreeing to be part of this, setting aside your time to speak on the panel. We really appreciate it. We will eventually upload a sort of highlight version on YouTube. We will plug all your social medias in there. So to people still on here, look forward to that. Yeah. That's it.
So we genuinely hoped if you are willing to maybe work with you in the future on more panels, maybe regarding more specific issues and stuff, because you guys have been great to work with. I'm quite sure I can speak on behalf of the team. And yeah, does Tiana, would you have anything to add?
I have nothing much to add, but just I really would like to thank all three of you for joining us today. And it's like we were all so nervous and stuff like that, but I'm so glad it went so well. So when we do finally put up the video and like finally edit it to like condense it and stuff like that, I would really love if you all three of you also like share it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all. That's all I asked for. You three was amazing today.
Yeah.
Really was.
So yeah, if
And also, Roshinee, your cat is really adorable.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you.
so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So first, I'm gonna end this stream, but I'll end the call in a bit. So I'll end the stream first. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, and someone in the stream just added another comment. Thank you for gracing us with your presence, Ramesh.
Ram, say bye.